It is in the guidance? Okay, thanks for oh, I can have a picture. Thanks, Alex. Maybe he's waiting for us. No. Yeah, it's good. Okay, thanks.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Patsy Lewis, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you, those of you in the room. It's thrilling to see so many flesh and blood people in the room, but I'm also happy that COVID has allowed us to engage with people outside of the room to let us know it's possible. And so I'm very happy to welcome parents, friends, family, neighbors who are very invested in the work that you guys do and are, with us to hear your presentations. For those outside of Brown, the capstone is a culmination of all the work that you have done at Brown, reflecting your interests, what you have made of your 4 years at Brown. And it could be a full honors thesis, it could be an independent study, or even a long paper within a class, a course. But ultimately, it is yours. You have designed it. You have brought your creativity and your intellect and your particular concerns to that body of work. So it's my pleasure to welcome Felipe, Felix, Mendez, Alexandra Ali, Nell Salzman, Max Harris, and Lenica Rivas Sanchez to present their capstone work today. And just reading their abstracts and the titles, they are taking us on a journey around Latin America, to Panama, and in the US, to the US-Mexico border, Texas, and Colombia. I should have mentioned Colombia before. And this is really exciting because you're also coming from different disciplinary perspectives, comparative literature, political science, public policy. So I am expecting a treat, and I'm really excited to hear. It's your opportunity not just to share with your friends and family, but also with one another, because all too often we're not always aware. I mean, research is a very solitary process. So it's wonderful to be able to share what you have been doing with all of us. So welcome all of you, and I'm really happy to be sharing this very important event with you all. I now turn you over to Professor Erica Durante, who is the Director of Undergraduate Research Studies here at CLACS.
Thank you very much, Patty, for this very kind, nice, welcoming introduction to today's LACA Undergraduate Research Day. So I'm very happy to welcome our students, LACA concentrators, their families, friends, colleagues, and alumni for attending here and online this event organized by our program. We call it here at Brown Concentration in Latin American Caribbean Studies. So my name is Erica Durante, and I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies of the Latin American Caribbean Studies program. And today, as Professor Lewis said, we have the great pleasure to share with you the findings, the ideas, the brilliant research projects that our senior graduating students have completed, particularly during the last year at Brown. I remember I'm also teaching a course that is called Preparation for Capstones and Honors Thesis in Latin American Studies. And typically when we start a course in September, we struggle a lot designing a research project from scratch, and then progressively over the weeks, the project sometimes remains, but most of the time completely changes. In addition, in our concentration, we have the possibility of completing like a research thesis, or also a creative project that students accompany with a reflective statement, like a more research segment in which they discuss somehow how their creative product, which can be any kind of creative object, is in fact relevant for the field that we study, for the region that we study, and for the disciplines that, that they are part of. So before, I will just explain quickly somehow how we are going to proceed. This year we have 5 students, over 8 graduating students who are presenting their honors thesis. And this is the first time after 2 years that this event is in person. And before giving them the floor, so I will present each of them. We'll have like 3 blocks of presentations. There are 5 students, so the first block, 2 students, and then 2 more students, and then finally one last student by alphabetical order. I will explain, there will be some Q&A. But I would like first to express our gratitude as a center to the colleagues from other departments at Brown who have devoted time and energy to mentor our concentrators, providing them with their expertise and insight from different fields of the humanities and the social sciences. I will name and acknowledge each of them individually while introducing the honors thesis candidates. And I will also like to recognize the work of 3 graduating students who are not able to join us today. So thanks and congratulations to Chiara Carlyle, to Teresa Conchas, and Ali Fang Orvart for completing their capstone in our concentration. So today's event will be structured in this way. I said 3 blocks, so each student will present their thesis for 10 minutes. In the first block, we'll hear Felipe Felix Mendez and Max Aris, just next to Felipe. And their presentations will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A. So you are invited to join us. Unfortunately, because we're not on Zoom, we cannot collect the questions from people online. In the second block, we will hear Alexandra Ali Martinez and Lenica Rivas Sanchez. And their presentations will also be followed by a 10-minute Q&A. And then the third block, we'll hear only, last but not least, Nell Salzman. And their presentation will be followed by a 5-minute Q&A. At the end of the presentation, we will also award the LACA 2022 Honors Thesis Prize. And we are very grateful to Professor Veronica Ingham here, Professor Claudia Elliott, and Professor Martinez Pinzon, who were part, together with Professor Lewis, of the Honors Thesis Prize Committee this year. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first Honors Thesis candidate, Felipe Felix Mendez. So I will first introduce each student individually. Felipe Felix Mendez is a senior from Panama and Uruguay, double concentrating in international and public affairs and Latin American and Caribbean studies. He has completed internships at the Atlantic Council and the Permanent Mission of Panama to the United Nations, as well as advised the Wall Street Journal and Panasonic. At Brown, Felipe has worked as Professor Veronica Ingham's teaching assistant in the course Economic Development in Latin America for several years, right? And as a student assistant at our Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, CLACS. He has also been involved with the Brown Political Review, the College Hill Independent, the Brown Refugee Youth Tutoring and Enrichment Program, and the Watson Student Advisory Council. I had the privilege of being Felipe's second reader, and I'm very grateful to Professor James Green from the History Department for serving as Felipe's primary advisor. The title of Felipe's thesis is Panama 2050, a Development Policy Report. Felipe.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today to speak about what is somehow still my favorite topic, which is my thesis, and it's titled Panama 2050, a Development Policy Report. I would like to start by, let's see if this works.
It just needs a second.
Yep. Or maybe here. Yeah, so I would like to start by placing all of you in a map. So Panama is the southernmost country in Central America, as you can see. I'm going to switch to the side. Panama is divided into 16 administrative regions. Those include 10 provinces and 6 semi-autonomous indigenous territories known as comarcas, which I will be referring to throughout the presentation. And it has a population of about 4.3 million people as of 2020. Panama is the wealthiest country in Latin America in terms of GDP per capita, surpassing Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, Mexico, and others. It achieved that status after being the fastest growing country in terms of GDP per capita in the region between 1989 and 2018. So it was not always the wealthiest in the region. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of the economy so you have some background going into the content. The Panamanian economy is small, open, and has been dollarized since 1904. Its economic ideology would be best described as crony capitalism, and it has a structure of a dual sector economy with a modern sector and a traditional sector with significant disparities in terms of technology and access to capital, as well as wages between the two of them. And it has a large informal sector which employs about 50% of Panama's occupied people. Now let's talk a little bit about the politics, the institutions. So Panama is a unitary, republican, democratic, and representative state. The government is organized into 3 branches: judicial, legislative, and executive. And that is similar to the US, which some of you may be more familiar with. In Panama, general elections are held every 5 years for all offices that are elected, so all elected officials serve concurrent 5-year terms. And it has been considered a free country by Freedom House since 1994. With that background, we can talk about the structure of the remaining of the presentation. So I will talk about my research question, then I will talk about why not everything is perfect in Panama, so the problem statement, and then we'll talk about some possible policy recommendations to resolve some of those issues in the realm of first institutions and then the economy. And lastly, we'll open up to Q&A. So in terms of my research question, it has 2 parts. The first part is, what are Panama's main shortcomings from a development standpoint? And the second part is, which policies would be advisable to rectify or address those shortcomings? Let's start with the problem statement. Nearly 1 in 5 Panamanians live in multidimensional poverty. In the 2 most populous indigenous comarcas, so those semi-autonomous territories that I have talked about, multidimensional poverty affects over 90% of households. In addition, corruption has cost Panama 1% of its GDP every year for the past decade, which is a significant drain of resources that could otherwise be used to improve the living standards of the Panamanian people. In addition, Panama's bureaucracy has been captured by clientelism. So essentially, votes are bought in exchange for jobs in the government and other sorts of favors and benefits. We can see that in this chart where the United Nations Development Program asked in 2006 a survey to Panamanians, why would you join a political party? And the primary reason, as 50.2% of respondents said, was in search of personal benefits, followed by 30% who said to secure employment. As a result, the Panamanian bureaucracy is bloated and in large part filled with unqualified individuals who are there because of political reasons rather than their qualifications. Panama also has exceptionally low tax revenues for its level of income. Panama is right here with 15% of GDP captured in tax revenues. That is less than half the OECD average. It's 7 percentage points lower than that for Latin America and the Caribbean, and it is also slightly lower than the African average. As a result, the Panamanian government sees itself with a pretty small budget relative to what it could have for its level of income to pursue the programs and policies that would benefit the Panamanian people. There are also major gaps in the quality, periodicity, completeness, and accessibility of data in Panama. Perhaps nothing illustrates this as well as knowing that there were 12 years in which Panama did not have a population census. The last one has been delayed for 2 years, and it will supposedly take place at the end of this year. There is also significant lack of data that I myself encountered doing this project in terms of diagnosing the situation of linguistic and racial minorities in Panama, there's very little data available of that. In addition, total factor productivity, which is a measure of how effectively and efficiently human capital, and labor are combined in the production process, is very low for Panama. It is essentially a binding constraint on economic growth. As you can see, for the last decade, between 2010 and 2019, it contributed negatively to economic growth, meaning that it essentially did not allow Panama to grow at its potential. Related to that, Panama has restrictive immigration laws which impede productivity and the development of new industries, so productive diversification, essentially. And lastly, for the problem statement, but certainly not least, Panama has a serious problem in terms of political representation of women, which reflects a broader problem of gender inequality, whereby Panama has a lower percentage of women in public offices than most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Is below average in every single office listed. So to recap, there are many reasons why Panama is not perfect. We have a significant poverty problem, corruption, a clientelistic bureaucracy, gaps in data, low tax revenue, low productivity, barriers to the spread of know-how, and gender inequality in political representation, and many other realms. With the table set, we can start to talk about policy recommendations in terms of how to address this, and I will do so at a very high level. So the first realm in which I have made policy recommendations in this thesis is in terms of institutions. The first recommendation in that sense is to dismantle clientelism, and that will require eliminating the sources of dependency that has allowed politicians to exploit and pursue this strategy. That requires eradicating poverty and universalizing access to infrastructure and public services, among other things. It also requires election reform. Panama should also replace its clientelistic bureaucracy with a world-class civil service staffed through meritocracy and impact evaluations. Should also strengthen the role of data in the policy process, both by gathering better data and by requiring that it is used in policy making. Simplify bureaucratic procedures with the goal of increasing tax revenues, also by increasing tax enforcement. With that, we can move on to the recommendations in the realm of the economy, how to make it more humane and competitive. The first of those is to invest in critical infrastructure. Some of the areas identified are universal access to clean water, access to sanitation in public schools, rural electrification, and broadband throughout the country. In addition to a functioning postal service, which is also a problem in Panama. Another policy recommendation that I have made is to adopt a quasi-universal basic income, which is essentially a monthly cash transfer set at the amount of covering your basic needs in what in Panama is known as la canasta básica. So basically, a bundle of goods that a household requires to essentially eat for a month. Another policy recommendation in the realm of economics is to promote productive diversification towards more complex economic activities, and that requires a policy of talent attraction, so removing some of those barriers to immigration, retention, and diffusion, so that it is spread throughout the economy and its benefits are reaped throughout. And lastly, to embrace a holistic approach to gender inequality, so both in terms of politics and economics, and that includes policies such as maternity leave, cash transfers, universal childcare, and others. And those are essentially the main problems and recommendations that I have identified in my thesis. And we'll have questions at the end of the blog. If you would like to access my complete thesis, you can scan that QR code and it will take you to the PDF. Thank you so much.
Hold your questions when we have the second presentation, this first block, and then we can sit there. Thank you very much, Felipe. It's great. Thanks for taking the time too. So I'm very pleased now to present Max Harris. We're going to move now from Panama to Argentina and from economics, political science into literature. So Max Harris is a senior from New York City. studying political science and Latin American Caribbean studies. Throughout his time at Brown, he has loved learning about Latin American societies through the distinct lens of culture, the arts, and government. In tandem with his studies, Max works at the Rhode Island Free Clinic, where he has helped to provide free healthcare to the Latin American community in Providence. After college, he hopes to continue practicing the Spanish language and to live for a short while in Buenos Aires. During his senior year, Max developed his fascination for Borgesian, from Borges, the author, metaphysics, into a final project entitled A quien leyere, Duplicity in the Works of Jorge Luis Borges. Max encourages everyone to dive into the fantastical and ingenious world of Latin American literature at least once at Brown. I had the privilege of being Max's primary advisor, and I'm very grateful to Professor Felipe Martinez Pinzon for serving as Max's second leader. As I just said, the title of Max's thesis and presentation, A quien leyere, Duplicity in the Works of Jorge Luis Borges. Thanks a lot, Max.
All right, so good morning, everyone. Before I start, I'd just love to say that I so appreciate all the support and kindness of all of my friends and family and professors who have helped me throughout this process, and it means so much to me to have you here today. And so thank you so much for coming. And so I'd just like to start out with a quick piece of background on who Borges is, for those of you who might not be as familiar. And so Borges was born in 1899 in Buenos Aires, a city in which he lived the vast majority of his life. And even from an incredibly young age, he was surrounded by literature. His father maintained a huge library, and in that library, he began to read pretty much everything he could get his hands on. Anything from obscure novels to Greek philosophy. And he even at the age of 9 translated Oscar Wilde's The Happy Prince, which is pretty incredible. And Borges was not just a prolific reader. He also wrote a series of ficciones, they're called fictions, which are often essayistic, they're short, they have incredible focus on the language he chooses, so every word truly counts. And these ficciones deal with issues of dreams, memory, time. And that's the reason that they fascinate me, and I think the reason that they fascinated him. And these are what I built my project around. So a few years ago, in senior year of high school, I came across Borges for the first time because I had this fantastic Spanish teacher who absolutely loved his work. And one of the first experiences I had with Borges was this story called El Otro, in which an older version of Borges encounters his younger self at the bank of a river in a different time, different rivers. And ultimately, the two try to understand what their circumstance is, how this encounter has occurred, and they decide that they are speaking in a dream. And during this conversation, one of them says that our clear obligation is to accept the dream as we have accepted the universe. And this quote has been very important to me. It initiated a lot of my interest in Borges. It also helped me to get here because I actually included it in my college essay. And now all these years later, it's had a big impact on my creative project. And there's a lot of ways that you can interpret it. One way is that you can take it as a justification of the act of trying to understand things that we cannot understand. It elevates the idea of doubt over perhaps certainty. It says that you shouldn't try, or you shouldn't refuse to try to understand the nature of time, of memory, things beyond human comprehension. It also creates a double between the universe as a physical entity and our perception of it, the dream in which we all live. So doubles, as I've just referred to, are equivalencies. They're comparisons between two like people generally, but also things, roles, ideas, notions, places. And between these doubles, we can come to understand each side of the duality a bit better. To give you more of a tangible example, I'd like to turn to a little passage in the preface to one of Borges' earliest works of poetry, Verbo de Buenos Aires, in which he said, "If the pages of this book offer some felicitous line or other, may the reader pardon me the discourtesy of having claimed it first. Our inconsequential selves differ but little. The circumstance that you are the reader and I the writer of these exercises is accidental and irrelevant." So at first this might be a bit jarring that you are accidentally not one of the greatest writers in perhaps world history. Though what I believe that he means is that the reader and the writer are inseparable. That the act of reading is an act of writing, because as you take in a story, you interpret it for yourself. You create it within your own mind. And in that role, you become a writer as well. So in my project, I've taken this claim literally, and I've written 3 creative stories in tandem with an analysis of Borges' stories as well. And I don't have so much time, so I'm going to run through this quickly. Though what I realized while I was writing is that the language that I chose, both knowingly and subtly, accorded with a mystery that I had in my mind, but that I wasn't necessarily able to express. And what I realized is that writing, language, and literature become a form of not only outward expression, but also of internal contemplation. So I believe that in many ways, Borges wrote his own stories as perhaps, basically his protagonists were often doubles of themselves. So he wrote his own stories, including doubles, that were almost like detectives in his own mind, solving his own mysteries. And the stories are, in some ways, a journey through the fears that plague him and the astonishment that came from inventing these enigmatic truths. So I'd like to start with the first chapter that I included in my thesis that deals with doubles of characters. And there's one story in particular in which Borges describes a peculiar type of double. It's called the other death, different from the other, by the way. And he says in the story that God, who cannot change the past, although he can change the images of the past, changed the image of death into one of unconsciousness. So in The Other Death, Borges writes of a war hero whose past is disarrayed by a labyrinth of decaying memories. In the end, he surmises that perhaps Pedro Damian, the fallen soldier, redeemed his legend on his deathbed. So as the protagonist travels through the story, he collects information about Damian's past, but it turns out that everyone has a different recollection of how he lived. Damian effectively exists in multiples, within the memories of those that surround him, and perhaps even in the eyes of God. His doubles exist throughout his memory. I wrote a story called The Watchmaker, where the protagonist follows a similar journey. In it, he recalls the beauty of a summer day during the frigid winter, and he endeavors to take pictures of the summer so that he can recreate that memory in his mind. But when he does so, and he looks back on those pictures, he finds an idealized version of his past, not one as it was, but a phantom who experienced the summer as he wished it to have been. Both encounters represent the collision between our perception of ourselves, born in the past, and who we are today. In both my story and The Other Death, recollection effectively is revision. By gazing into our memories, we effectively change them. So it's not just characters that can be duplicated. It's also the roles we inhabit, the roles that items, that ideas, that they embody. There's one quote from a story called Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, in which Borges explains that the protagonist's admirable ambition is to produce a number of pages which coincided, word for word and line for line, with those of Miguel de Cervantes. So this task seems seemingly impossible. How is Menard to make a perfect copy, but also a similar, updated work? The doubled novel illustrates an old philosophical idea called the ship of Theseus, in which Theseus travels out on his ship, goes to war, and returns. And philosophers ask whether the ship is the same. Did it perhaps change when a certain nail was replaced, or when Theseus was no longer its captain? This question forces us to evaluate whether Menard's novel has become a double because it has been revolutionized by time, because he perhaps recreated it, or because maybe it has a new author. In my story, I replicate that confusing but fascinating dynamic, where a house, a stately home, is disassembled and then rebuilt in another portion of the city. Similarly to Borges' story, my story asks whether the chateau has been destroyed, rebuilt faithfully, rebuilt in some delinquent form, or whether it's in fact a rhyming bateau or ship. What my story and Borges' stories taken together reveal is that each interpretation is mutually dependent on layered divergencies. Only through comparison of these two life ideas, such as the chateau and the ship, or the book and what the book, or the novel and the novel's past, we come to understand the significance of each within the story. This is the role of the double as an interpretive tool, as a mode of comparison. It reveals that the ship, like all things and all forms of identity, is whatever we perceive it to be. Here, you create the story alongside me through your own perspective lens. So finally, I'd like to talk about duplicity on a larger scale, the duplication of the universe itself. Interestingly, Borges' ficciones warn of the hubristic bounds of human thought at the same time as they invite us to challenge and comprehend our reality in new ways. So essentially, he says, don't venture into the realm of God, at the same time as he talks about created universes, about memory, about time, all things that we associate with things beyond human comprehension. And in one of Borges' stories, called Plon Upar Orbis Tertius, and in my own, called The Fallacy of a Voyager, the narrator discovers a nascent universe, which exists only in the minds of men. Here, the protagonist establishes equivalency between the universe as a physical object and the universe as a perceived notion. These ideas operate particularly fluidly within Borges' notion of idealism. This is a philosophy that centers perception, vantage points, over things themselves. They only exist insofar as you can see them, you can process them, and understand them. So what this means is that by perceiving the universe, we create it, and the same can be said of a text that we read. By reading it, we too create that text. So if there's one lesson that I've learned from creating this project, it's that I invite you all to embrace the notion of the double, and to imagine yourselves as empowered readers, creating the text as you take it in. And so I want to leave you with one quote that I'm not going to explain, but that might be nice to think about afterwards, which Borges writes, "Why does it disturb us that Don Quixote be a reader of the Quixote? These inversions suggest that if the characters of a fictional work can be readers or spectators, we, its readers or spectators, can be fictitious." So I'd just like to close by saying, I have the slide up here. It doesn't matter. But I'd like to close by saying a huge and final thank you to Erica and Felipe for their incredible advice, patience, and suggestions throughout this project. I truly couldn't have done it without either of you. And so I appreciate it enormously, and I'm thrilled that I had your fantastic help. So yeah, that is everything. Thank you.
Congratulations. So why don't you sit there and we will see the questions. Okay, so we are ready for our Q&A time. 10 minutes for Felipe and Max. I think it's important to somehow bring questions also to make them, respond about the research, also beyond what we heard today here, since it's an entire process. Right? Professor Patty-Lewis. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for two very different presentations. So I would stay in my lane and address my question to Felipe. Felipe, you gave us a sense of what's wrong with Panama and what is necessary to fix it. Can you give us a sense of how Panama came to be what we see today, and what some of the impediments would be to fixing it? Because I think it's difficult to arrive at conclusions without understanding the nature of the problem rather than just its manifestation. So I wanted you to speak to, where does the money go? Where does Panama's GDP go? And did you also reflect on what it means for a country to be rich when 50% or more of its people are poor? And Max, I thought you were going to hear a little snippet of a story of yours, but?
Should I answer or are we taking?
Maybe we can collect questions. Okay, do you want to write them down or
Yes,
something?
that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, please. Your name is?
Laila.
Laila.
So Felipe, I have a question directed to you. I'm very interested in the process of how you wrote your thesis and what sources you consulted. So could you speak a little bit about, what sources, government or otherwise, that you consulted, and what was your process? And you mentioned also that there was a big lack of data, and did you notice that was in specific areas, and how could Panama improve the collection?
I also have a question for you. I was really interested in the fact that you explained that there's this huge gender imbalance in government, and in a lot of my classes I've learned about how some of the problems that you've described have been helped by there being more women in government, or at least there's a correlation there. I'm curious whether there are any solutions that you have in mind that involve perhaps like gender quotas. I've heard of that being used in other countries, and just your thoughts on whether that could be a good solution.
Yep.
Dr. Kristen Collins, and then we have Anne.
So I have a question for both of you. Well, for Felipe, it's kind of along the same lines. I'm curious about sort of your methods and your methodological decisions in light of the gaps in data that you mentioned. So how did you make the choices around the method? And maybe it's helpful to say that coming from sort of a more humanities place, I'm curious about kind of the why of the methods. And then for Max, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the process of mirroring Borges' strategies and sort of what do emerging writers or literature scholars get from studying Borges or any other author in this way?
I just wanted to say thank you for such wonderfully insightful presentations, and I'm sure with all the work that you've given to your thesis, it's very nice to have that sense of the culmination of your work. My questions are to both of you, sort of looking forward after this work for Felipe. How, since this is so grounded in policy actions that are action items that you would want to see be taken, what will be your next steps in making sure that those who need to hear are able to hear, or what kind of actions will you be able to take as an individual? And for Max, I'm also wondering sort of what kind of other duplicities would you be interested in sort of, because you've talked about sort of duplicities that exist in Borges' universe, but what are others that you might be interested in exploring and creating yourself?
Erika, can I do like one
Please.
more? Yeah, Max, I have a question. Because I want to like come together with the leadership part and the policy part. What do you think every Latin American government can learn from Borges' literature, or should apply from Borges' literature?
That's a fantastic question. I don't know if there is an answer.
Yeah,
Tough question.
It will be difficult, Max. Veronica, please, Professor Ingham.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on what's your name?
Daniel.
Yes, Daniel.
Daniel.
No,
Al.
Al.
Yes.
Al's question to Felipe. By the way, both great presentations, super interesting, and I love the fact that they're so different and one came after the other. It's really wonderful. It's a testament to what happens here at Brown, really. I would like to know if you have thought about what it would take to make some of these recommendations happen, and if you have, what are you, in your mind, the biggest roadblocks? What would you have to overcome to do that? I know that sometimes implementation and the political process is one of the biggest challenges that face these policy reports, and I don't know what the situation is specifically in Panama as you see it.
If I can say something before, oh, please.
No, I just want to say to Max that I'm from Argentina, and I'm not very well read in Borges, so I really appreciate the work you've done, because it has really been a great introduction for me.
Please.
I just had a quick question for Max on kind of your writing process and this process of mirroring, and whether you, or how you found inspiration for the topics of your stories, maybe beyond Borges, or whether there were like certain things, certain other authors who inspired you, or things from life, and what you drew on to create your story.
I would just say something, so in the meantime you can think about the questions. Yeah, I admire you a lot, both of you, especially because I know where all these processes come from and all the discussions we had, and I really think that you have achieved very maturely like amazing findings. Obviously, I know more about Borges than I know about the economic development of Panama, and I've worked on issues of double self Borges, and many discussions brought us to like Max project, and I really want to say that Max, you astonished me. I already told you when I read the thesis, like the quality of your of your reading of Borges, your interpretation, really the subtleness, everything is just like the maturity of a scholar. I was very surprised because Max is not from literature. I mean, he's from political science and Latin American studies, but he's not formed to the methodology, just also to answer Kristen, of literary studies per se. So for me, it was really a brilliant reading, and only someone really particularly smart and sensitive can reach this level of understanding of so difficult, visions that he had about the universe in this way of understanding as a duplicity. I mean, I read a lot about this, and I never found something so clear and achieved. Congratulations, like huge.
Thank you so much.
I'm really astonished. I give you time to answer, process the question. Maybe you want to make a selection, Felipe, I don't know, and also Max, go ahead.
You want to start?
I'm happy either way. We could like trade off each question.
Perfect.
I can go for it to start. So your question on the process of mirroring Borges' strategies and what we get from this, I think it developed, a lot of it was organic, because the first time I wrote a story in his style, I just had his voice in my mind and I put something to paper and I read it and I kind of felt that it did actually have a connection. Maybe it's because I've spent so many years reading Borges that it just has always been at the top of my mind. Though for this creative project, I definitely focused a more specific methodology that I guess developed just after a few times of imitating his writing. And what I did was a few things. The first thing I did was I read his stories and I wrote down a series of their characteristics. So there's a lot of things unique to his stories, like the emotions of astonishment are very prevalent, whereas other types of emotions like love aren't necessarily relevant to his type of writing. There are other qualities like oxymoron, parable, paradox. All of these things are qualities of his writing. And so I think I looked from the perspective of what his tropes are and tried to inject them into the writing at the same time as I had his voice in my head from contemplating his work over so long. The question of what we get from imitating an author in this fashion is interesting because I think in some ways it's personal because it was my experience that I had, and it's hard to explain that to everyone. And in some ways it's very external in that you can look at my analysis and see how the writing helped me to come to it. But what I think I came to understand in imitating is that there are some things about literature which are very difficult to put to, I guess, like a textual explanation, and that sometimes the best way to explain literature is to write literature. And so something that I really enjoyed doing was analogizing, was looking for commonalities between my thinking about Borges and his stories, and then actually writing them into stories themselves. And so I think it's a really useful tool to process literature that is best processed through the same, I guess, mode that it was created. Makes some sense. Do you want to jump on the next question?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna start the question that you asked me, which had to do with gender inequality and political representation and kind of what came up in regards to gender parity quotas and this sort of things. So, okay, I think one of the first important things to say is that it's clear that in Panama, it's not that women are not interested in politics or not interested in political parties. They're joining political parties roughly in the same proportions as men, and they're also voting in roughly the same proportions as men. However, they're not getting into leadership roles in the same proportions as men, and that shows us that there's some barriers there. And one of the barriers that I came across, which is why I talked about a holistic approach to gender inequality, even though I wasn't able to elaborate as much on it in the presentation, is that women share a ridiculously higher proportion of care work at home, which is generally unpaid. And that certainly poses a barrier to many, many things, ranging from them to become economically independent, and therefore in many ways also socially independent. But it also takes up time that they could be spending in becoming active in political parties and running a campaign and so on. So essentially, there are multiple barriers that are quite structural, and it's not just that they're not wanting to run or that only political parties are not letting them run. It's all of that. There's also gender parity quotas in Panama only for political parties, but they're quite easy to circumvent, and there's not strong enough sanctions in cases where political parties don't abide by them. So it is also mentioned in my thesis that those should be made more robust, both in the sense of closing loopholes, but also in the sense of increasing sanctions in cases where they are not honored by political parties. So that was my answer to your question.
That's very, very interesting. It's interesting how they have those laws but don't enforce them. I'm surprised to hear that, but it sounds like a great solution maybe if they could start.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, so I'm
I
gonna...
would say that you have like 4 more minutes, like
4 more minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna give a very brief answer to, I'll group 2 questions together. Both of your questions were fantastic about other duplicities and about what Latin American governments can apply from Borges' literature. That one's very hard to answer. Great question.
Ironic.
Yeah. I think as far as duplicities, I started to see them everywhere as I was working on this project. That's the amount of time I spent. You can find doubles in almost anything, almost to the point of absurdity. So it's very important to try to look at them as a way to like refine your comparisons as opposed to a way to find connections between things that aren't necessarily connected. Though some other duplicities that I've enjoyed looking at have definitely been in both film and other forms of literature. For example, Dostoevsky is very focused on the concept of the double in Crime and Punishment, for example. And also, I've seen quite a few films with doubles. Now I'm struggling to remember.
Black Swan.
I haven't seen Black Swan, but I try to do that.
Fight Club.
Fight Club, I also haven't seen that. I'll let you know if anything comes to mind. And about what Latin American governments can apply. This one is really tough. I think that one thing that you can take away from Borges' work is, I mean, first of all, in some of his stories, he just has some like very clear anti-fascist messaging, which is always, I think, a good thing. So more specifically, I think that he has a very imaginative way at looking at problems and solutions, a way of completely, divorcing from any sort of precedent and trying to understand things as from their most essential qualities. And perhaps, like, if politicians could understand people's demands, in a way that was, separate from, I guess, years and years of like political maneuvering, there could be, I guess, a more like applicable solution to people's problems. But I know it's a super vague answer.
No, it was a tough question and an amazing answer.
Okay, Professor Luis, answer a question over coffee if you want, because it's going to take me a longer answer. I'm going to...
Over lunch.
Yes, I'm going to combine the other 2 pairs of questions. So, to Laila and Kristen, essentially, so I consulted census data. I also looked at places like Our World in Data. You saw that I had plenty of charts to get a comparative lens of like what do these numbers and percentages mean compared to other countries. I also read documents that other people had written, kind of trying to imagine a new development model for Panama, and sort of tried to see where I thought that they had a good point and where there were gaps. And usually there were pretty good documents with the economics, but less strong documents with the institutions, in my opinion. I also read other books that were talking about the institutions and politics, tried to understand the context, and myself identify some solutions for those gaps. And with regards to the gaps in data, I knew that I couldn't do everything in this thesis, so I tried to focus on proposing solutions to the things that I could diagnose more clearly. And the places where I couldn't diagnose them as clearly, I will try my best to work on that over my lifetime.
Indigenous communities.
Yes, exactly. And then with respect to Alp and Professor Ingham's questions, so kind of what would it take to make these recommendations real? The biggest roadblock in terms of like proximate cause, that's the problem. It's the National Assembly in Panama. Like, it's the interest of people in the National Assembly, so the equivalent to Congress, are stacked against passing basically every single thing that I've proposed, because the political careers of politicians depend on clientelism. They depend on people needing, that job, that favor, that subsidy, and so on. So essentially, yes, that is, in terms of proximate causes, the biggest roadblock. But of course, if we look deeper, the problem is how do we change the makeup of the National Assembly? And there are major barriers there in terms of the electoral laws, and many of those things I cover in my thesis. The question is, how do we get to the point where those things get passed? And there's some interesting things going on in Panama right now. Actually, Daniel here is involved in one of them. There's a coalition of people essentially trying to change the makeup of the assembly by taking over positions in the National Assembly and also in local government, and that is one avenue that seems promising. And to add this question more specifically, what am I thinking of doing in this realm? I am identifying a series of actions that I can take to follow up on this thesis. One of them is I want to basically convert it into a column written in Spanish. So essentially, every single idea, I'm making it into an article that is more accessible, and I'm going to try to publish it so it reaches a Panamanian audience. I'm also going to try to push these ideas with policymakers and aspiring policymakers, such as the coalition that I just mentioned. And actually, last weekend I met with somebody who I'm also hoping to get some of those ideas into his mind, and I got him to take a copy of my thesis, so that was exciting. Yes, no, it's fine.
And Felipe, the questions I ask become even more important
Yes,
as you go forward.
certainly. Any guys insisting that I say who I was meeting with, so it's Ruben Blades. He is a very famous Panamanian salsa singer, multi-Grammy Award winner, and he was also a presidential candidate in Panama in the past, and he's kind of one of the figures that is sort of shaping public opinion ahead of this election. So we're kind of exchanging ideas about some of these policies.
He was also Minister of Panama of Tourism for 5 years. So
Minister
of Tourism.
So now he has Felipe's thesis.
Yeah. And he may run for president. So
Oh, really?
yeah, he's thinking about it. Who knows?
Okay, well, thank you very much. You stay, right? You stay, so just a reminder, we are moving to block 2, our 2 new presenters. Please try to stay. We also have a reception at the end. To celebrate our students. If you cannot stay, try to come back at around 12. Okay? Thank you. So, Alexandra, Ali y Lenica. Ali primero, sí. So it's my pleasure now to introduce. Okay, they were all Philips. Lenica, después de Okay, vamos con la presentación. So, I'm very pleased now to introduce Alexandra Ali Martinez, who is a senior from Chula Vista, California, now concentrating in international public affairs and Latin American Caribbean studies. Ali has focused her study on the US-Mexico border, child and youth migration, and international law to serve her community. Ali embarked on 2 honors theses at Brown this year. An oral history project focusing on her family living at the US-Mexico borderlands for Latin American studies, and an ethnographic on the impacts of US immigration policies on asylum-seeking children for the concentration in international public affairs. In her community, Ali has done extensive work alongside international organizations and binational public interest legal service organizations with a focus on immigration reform. Ali is a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. She will look forward to growing as a community-engaged scholar as she pursues her doctoral degree in migration studies. And congratulations again and again. After Oxford, she will attend law school to become an attorney focused on international human rights. I had the privilege of being Ali's second reader, and I'm very grateful to Professor Iris Montero, who should be there. We really hope and say hi to Iris for serving as Ali's primary advisor for this project and many others, right? The title of Ali's thesis is 1,950-mile-long open bond, an international family border memoir.
Alrighty, well, thank you everyone for coming. So some background on this project is that I was born and raised by a loving migrant family at the US-Mexico borderlands. And in our Southern Californian migrant communities, vulnerabilities are ever present due to restrictive and oppressive US immigration policies. So I grew up listening to the stories of my grandmother, Nana, my aunt Yoli, Yaya, and my mom, Yvonne, which is on the next slide. right here. And growing up, I just remember feeling very frustrated seeing the representations of the Latinx diaspora on the television that was supposed to mirror the US national imaginary. And so when I saw mothers and sisters venerated for their strength, it did not depict the pain I knew they held. So I realize now that that irritation stems from a largely decontextualized imagery that intended to represent our migrant communities and the cultural and social fabric of the US-Mexico borderlands, but failed in conveying the complexity of their lives and their histories. And so it is the figure of my grandmother, my mother and aunt that provided the necessary grounding for me, and it is their stories that formed the core of my thesis. So oral history methodology is what I decided to use for my creative honors thesis project. And oral history has been collected since communication began. For many cultures, verbal transmission of knowledge is an important method for passing down and preserving ideas, rituals, and histories. And this process emphasizes preservation through archival techniques. So this includes verbally sharing stories in the form of conversations to produce a primary historical source. Going back to the figures of my grandmother, my aunt, and mother, they are filled with histories of their experiences of U.S. immigration policies at the U.S.-Mexico borders. And after theorizing in the abstract about the border throughout my college career, as my senior year approached, I decided to revisit their histories and privilege their experiences, voices, and knowledge. And so I explored how these policies shape the lives of my family intergenerationally by solely centering their voices. And beyond this oral history project, I wanted to address some of the human rights violations and systems of oppression they experience. So I decided to follow oral history not only as an academic method, but also as a method of healing open wounds, hence the title. And this experimental oral history methodology stemmed from recording conversations that included archival and their indexing, pictures, and maps. So intergenerational oral history is a process that prioritizes collecting stories through multiple generations. And by bringing together different generations, we create an opportunity to share wisdom and experience. But I wanted to create a space for my family to reflect with memories in a way that was that did not have any kind of power imbalance typically present in interviews. So every weekend in the summer of 2021, my mother and I visited my grandmother and my aunt in Calexico, California. And on Sunday mornings, we would gather around the table, press record on our phone, and talk for hours, sometimes until we went to bed. And it was gathering around the table that was particularly intentional because I wanted it to be kind of mirroring our typical chismeando sessions. Chismear is a traditional form of sharing anecdotal and personal experience in a reciprocal and informal manner. As opposed to gossiping, chismear can be a process of sharing, supporting, contradicting, and building upon each other in ways that value our intimate theory in the flesh. So our weekend chisme sessions became a ritual that allows us to create networks of support between ourselves and also our community members if they join us in our dinner table. But specifically during this project, our chismeando allow us to create a process of narration of our experience in a deeply intimate setting and vulnerable space. So in a way, the table became a self-affirming site where my grandmother, my mother, and aunt felt most liberated to practice and vocalize resistance against everyday experiences and family histories of U.S. immigration policies. In contrast to the chismes that my grandmother, aunt, and mother shared, my chismes at times were academically inspired to include key concepts that I learned during my time at Brown on the topic of migration. And intrigued by some of these concepts, my mother and my aunt decided to read a little bit of Undocumented Americans, The Borderlands, La Frontera, This Bridge Called My Back, and Children of the Land. Of course, they were just paragraphs here and there, but it really allowed us to have processing tools to be able to identify, name, and discuss and process experiences. So after amassing 120 hours of recorded conversation, I indexed the testimonios into 61 thematic vignettes, and these vignettes allowed the generations to be contrasted against each other. And during the semester and this year, I also followed up with informal FaceTime calls to be able to fill in the gaps if one person commented on something versus another during these conversations. So when recollections mostly converged, but even when they diverged, they were actually extremely rich because they reveal how a single event can be experienced differently by different generations. And they also make visible the dynamics between my grandmother, aunt, and mother, as they at times altered roles of caregivers to their family in the borderlands. And also it just highlights their personalities and their experiences and responses to joint family experiences. So we have the academic method that we just spoke about, but how do we use oral history as a method of healing our traumas? So while collecting the oral histories, it can be a particularly charged event for trauma survivors because it entails great vulnerability and the complexity in interviewing trauma survivors like my grandmother, my mother, and aunt is that the process requires the emergence of a narrative, and that goes counter to coping mechanisms with trauma. So sometimes my grandmother, mother, and aunt decided to explain their experiences in ways that they mediated their coping how they coped with the event. So this included like silence, avoidance, or mediation. However, through mothering, care, and support between ourselves, we were able to piece together scattered painful experiences. Sometimes my family members skipped over a traumatic event to focus on a particular positive aspect that occurred after, or sometimes they decided to share a different experience altogether. Sometimes key people, events, and themes were left unsaid, but as a family member, I was able to identify those as their very coping mechanisms. However, oral history did become a tool of healing in the sense that although they could not process the events as they were happening, they had the opportunity to be able to recount their experience in ways that allowed them to negotiate, mediate, and construct their narratives to ultimately grant them agency that they were denied most of their lives. At the conclusion of the oral history project, my family's experiences really did allow us to heal deep, open wounds through reclamation, and we feel empowered to take part of advocacy in our migrant community. And beyond supporting our migrant communities, we did identify the need to seek reparations for the injustices done. And although our blueprint for a different America, the different America we have envisioned is not yet formulated, we are certain and wholeheartedly agree with Moriaga's assertion that the revolution begins at home. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure to thank my primary advisor, Professora Iris Montero, my secondary reader, Erika Durante, Kristen for providing advice throughout this entire year, and of course also my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt for participating and helping me through everything.
Thank you very much. So we will move now to Lenica and then we'll have Ali back. Okay? Quédate lista. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Lenica Rivas Sanchez. Lenica is a senior from Mesa, Arizona, with roots in Sonora, Mexico, where both her parents immigrated from. Growing up in the beautiful desert of Arizona has instilled a passion in her for environmental justice, advocacy for legislation concerning our climate, and public policy work addressing social inequities. Being the first in her family to attend college, Lenica was able to find community within Casa Machado Brown's Cultural Spanish House, where she served as president. On campus, Lenica has also engaged with Brown's Office of Sustainability as an intern, Latinas at Brown as the Public Relations Director, the Outdoor Leadership Environmental Education Program as a student mentor, and MECHA. MECHA is?
The Mexican, I forget, it's like really long.
Okay. Like association.
Yeah.
Abroad, LACA has taken courses aimed at understanding international relations and conflict resolution, studying the challenges of peace building in Bogota, Colombia, which supplemented their LACA honors thesis. As LACA pursues a career in public service, she hopes to radically engage with environmental justice policy and Latin American politics. I had the privilege of being LACA's primary advisor and very grateful to Professor Lucila Nejamquis for serving as LACA's second reader. The title of LACA's creative thesis is Bogotá por las calles, arte, dolor y resistencia, a multimedia production.
Muchas gracias, Erika. Hola, soy Lenica. I am a senior graduating in environmental science and Latin American and Caribbean studies. And so my thesis is a creative thesis, so I will be presenting the context within the thesis through the images which I took while I was in Bogota, Colombia. So in 2019, I went to study the peace conflict in Bogota, and this is something that is not really talked about in a lot of other countries unless you study peace studies or conflict resolution when dealing with like a 60-year civil war, which is what Colombia has been through since the 1940s. And so in this photo we have here, this is a photo I took of Bogota, and as you can see, it's very, very big, and this is just a small portion of it. And when I was there, I stayed at the Universidad de los Andes, which hosted the course that I was taking. And we were really close to La Candelaria, which is one of the most colorful neighborhoods in Bogota. And you can kind of see here, but not necessarily, like towards the bottom, a lot of like the colorful buildings. So almost all of Bogota has graffiti, and this is because in, let me just go to this one. In 2011, Justin Bieber went to visit Bogota, and he was graffitiing something, because in Bogota, graffiti culture is very, very big because it stems from the hip hop movement, which is very anti-establishment. And so yeah, when Justin Bieber came, he graffitied, and a few hours later, there was this young boy, which is pictured here in the graffiti, and he was graffitiing under an underpass, and he was shot by the police, and the police staged that he was that he had a gun, and people found out, and so there was a lot of outrage, and that eventually led to Colombia legalizing graffiti, which is actually very, very big. But under this context, graffiti also kind of blurs with murals, and so you can kind of see that here. And I will be exploring the different styles and techniques that a lot of these artists employ. But most of it is done with aerosol work, so that's why it's still considered graffiti. So yeah, this is the boy, and this graffiti is done by Bastardia, who is one of the only few female graffiti artists in Bogota, or at least one of the few really recognized ones. And so yeah, I will be exploring the history as I go through the images. And that's kind of what I did throughout my honors thesis, using the images to supplement. And I call this a multimedia production because in the end I have created a video, an audio-visual representation of my experience and the history of Colombia. And so I utilize my images and some audio clips that I will share with you to bring you to Bogota, Colombia. And I also wanted to mention that I took all these pictures with something called the Fuji camera, which is a virtual disposable camera replica, and I utilized this camera because I really liked the way it saturated the images. It brought out more of the hyperpigmentation, and it also added these streaks of light that you see throughout the images, and every image is different because of it. And I feel like it really just brings it more to life, and it also has this timestamp, and it's based on the timestamp that would be in disposable photos, and it has the year 1998 because that was the year when disposable cameras were the most in. But yeah, that's the camera that I utilized, and here in this graffiti you can see how explicit it is in highlighting anti-imperial notions and issues with the narco state in Colombia. And this graffiti right here is done through different styles. So you can see we have stencils that are used, and this is mostly used because a lot of graffiti artists are always on the move, are always trying to find easier ways to paint, because even though graffiti is legal, you do have to ask whoever is the owner of that wall if you can paint on it. And that's really the main way to do it, but you do have to ask for permission. And if that permission isn't granted, the person who owns the wall, whether it is like public or private, can call the police and still get arrested. And so even though graffiti is legal, artists still face a lot of police violence and a lot of hate from residents in the city who see it as not an art. And so this is called Guerreros Millonarios, and it's done by an artist named Yurika. And this is speaking about young warriors who have had to fight in the Colombian Civil War. And most of the war was actually fought in the rural areas of Colombia and not necessarily experienced in the city as much as it was in the country land. And so the art really is bringing the conflict to the city. It's bringing the conflict to the people who are actually responsible at sometimes for enabling the war. And I also want to mention that in 2016, Colombia was voting for peace, and the first round they voted no, and this was crazy. And they voted no because a lot of the information that was held within the peace deal addressed gendered violence, a lot of human rights issues, and the president at the time was very far right, and he shared a lot of like fake news media that said, oh, if the peace deal comes into place, people are gonna turn gay, people are gonna have abortions, and because it was just very liberal and very focused on addressing a lot of these issues. And so when I got to Bogota, I really couldn't avoid the art. It is literally everywhere and all kinds of different dimensions and different spaces. The image we have on the left is called The Invisible Kiss, and this one attempts to bring the different levels of intimate care that can be seen throughout. And then on the right, we have this bird, and this was done collectively through 3 artists, who one is a father and his 2 sons who work together collectively and create a lot of the murals that we will see throughout the images. And so here's another example. And this picture, as you can see, has a lot of layering of graffiti. And so since graffiti is also very temporary but long-lasting, in Colombia, it's very well known to always be changing, and new artists will come once they get permission. Sometimes not, depending on the way that they would rather go about their art. But yeah, it just keeps on building one after the other. And so this image before was a different face, but it just transformed into this boy who is kind of speaking or trying to illustrate his reaction to the state and the issues that are occurring. And so when I was in Bogota, I actually engaged in the Bogota graffiti tour, and this was done both via walking and through bicycles, which was really, really cool just to see the city in this way. And we had our tour guide who is right here, and the tour was bilingual, and they also kind of really explain the art and what it means, because as a tourist you get to see it and the art speaks for itself, but there's so much deep just pain, and like I call the photo series Arte, Dolor y Resistencia, and they really explain the context within the images, and so I wanted to share that as well. And here you can see us engaging with the art, and this graffiti specifically is very influenced by punk rock, and this is done through a collective in Bogota, and so a lot of the graffiti artists have come together to create collectives so that they can get more funding for a lot of the art. And a lot of this graffiti also has brought up tensions within the urban art community in Bogota, because traditional graffiti artists are now facing new, very well-known mainstream international artists who are coming into Bogota and making the murals. And so that's also kind of changing dynamics, and that's something that I got to see as like we explored the walls. And so here you can see different styles, and so we have like the big block lettering on the right images, and on the top of the left, but we also have like the traditional tagging. And so there's just a mix of both of these different types of graffiti, which is, yeah, literally everywhere. As you can see here on the right, it's in, like with the stickering on the aluminum. And yeah, here it's literally in a lot of communities, and a lot of stores and commercial places actually bring artists and commission artists because it actually attracts tourists. So in Colombia, they are experiencing a big boom of tourism because of the art, and it's actually helped revitalize a lot of communities and help them economically. But it's also, tourism has also brought a lot of other consequences with it. But I also wanted to touch on this image right here. You can kind of see an array of different styles and techniques. That we still have the stencil, which is the three boys right there, but we also have like the different block letters and the swooshes of aerosol, the tag, so it's just a mix. And so a lot of the art also speaks to the environmental aspect of Colombia and their animals and the environment. And this image done right here on the left is by an artist named Rhodes, and he likes to paint eyes in different ways. And he mentions this because when you put eyes on something, it's watching you. And so it's trying to, again, elicit that feeling that the outskirts and the animals and the environment is watching you and what's happening, but also that they are affected. So here in this image on the right, you can see that there's these like plane bombs, and they like to, yeah, drop bombs. And then we have these national birds who also face the violence. It's not just the humans, but it's also the environment. And so yeah, here we have this other image, which is a mix of stencil and different types of aerosol work. As you can see, it's even done in the windows. And this is a depiction of a monkey who is playing this traditional Colombian music piece. And as he's playing it, you can see that these birds are flying out, and it's representing loss and a lot of change. And so yeah, it's trying to bring that and depict that in the city. But a lot of it is also, like I mentioned before, very explicit in raising awareness about what is happening and what has happened for decades. In the image on the left, this is called Piña Latina, and it's by an artist called DJ Lou. And he is very intentional about his art in terms of, like you can see, this is the piña grenade, and it's speaking to a lot of landmines that were left in rural areas in Bogota, in Colombia, so outside the city of Bogota actually. And so these landmines are still everywhere, and a lot of kids and people will just be walking and it explodes. And so the violence is still happening today. Even though the war started decades ago, the people are still experiencing it. And here you can also see the artist making the art in real time, and you can see like there used to be a different graffiti, and now there's this new one that's replacing it. But that art is done by a collective as well, and so yeah. Here we have more stencil work, and here we have another image. And in Colombia, there is a lot of anti-Afro-Colombian and anti-Blackness, which is experienced in a lot of the Pacific communities, and that's something that's also brought to the city to just, raise awareness about all of these different things. And here, we have more art. So I just, wanted to share with you guys. They're also raising awareness about the indigenous communities in Colombia that are being affected by a lot of these policies. And the art is just very bright, very beautiful. It's everywhere. And this is actually a center for memory and peace in Colombia, which Colombia has been trying to implement restorative justice policies. And so now there are centers and spaces for people to
express their pain and the trauma, but trying to utilize it to help heal generations. And here, when I was there, I got to see the UN Colombia mission, which they are verifying whether or not Colombia is implementing the peace deal. And so it was very cool to be able to talk to both ends, because we also spoke with some ex-guerrilla members who were involved in the war. And so what follows is a multimedia production that I created, and hopefully it transports you.
Just 2 minutes.
Yeah. Is the audio working? No.
Well, that's a big deal.
I don't think the audio output was like part of the process of setting it.
Maybe it will work.
Can you try?
Oh, it just says. No, you would already hear it.
Maybe there's like a volume slider on the screen.
Do you have it on your iPad?
I do.
The
I can play the audio on the iPad, yeah. Sorry, guys. Okay.
Bogota, like any other city, is the physical manifestation Bogota, like any other city, is the physical manifestation of the political, economic, social forces at stake. The difference in Bogota is that those forces here are good.
El mural más complejo y todo lo que esté en la mitad de eso, hacerlo brutal, los props, todo eso, digamos que ya eso es un círculo muy reducido.
Porque era el sueño de todos cuando éramos niños, rayar las paredes, una vez rayamos las paredes.
Y digamos que estos muros grandes empezaron a llamar más la atención que el graffiti que antes estábamos haciendo aquí en celular.
Está en un punto de vanguardia artística, está en la calle. Me gusta pensar que es como un llamado a la conciencia, a la memoria, a nuestro origen, por ende pues también nuestro destino. Estamos en ese proceso también de revolución y también de integración.
No solamente con un aerosol, porque hay gente que piensa que graffiti es solamente porque pinta con un aerosol y no, pues yo puedo hacer graffiti hasta con una punta de un bisturí.
La idea que se tiene espacio público es muy corta. El espacio público comprende muchas cosas, la ciudad es de todo. Y en realidad hay un montón de espacios por ocupar, por usar. No solo son las paredes, están también las canetas de basura, están los semáforos, están los paraderos, están las señales de tránsito, está algo del mobiliario, está el piso. En realidad todo puede comunicar y no me parece que la comunicación sea atente contra la seguridad de algo.
forgot to mention it a little while ago. This multimedia production was inspired by sound photography. And so it's basically trying to bring sound from what the image elicits within you. And so I grabbed audio clips from different areas, but utilized the photos to kind of, bring you to Colombia.
Oh. Okay, so we are now opening for the Q&A for LACA and Ali from the US-Mexico border to Colombia, Bogota. Professor Patsy Lewis has a question, number one, and then Kristen, Veronica, please go ahead.
Thank you for two very fascinating presentations. Ali, at some point, I'd actually like to see your piece and to see what your family, the different members have to say. I'm really looking forward to seeing that. Lenica, this is the first time I felt like I have to visit Colombia. I mean, you know a lot about Colombia. You know about the war, you know about the peace process, you know about the problems with drugs. But this is the first time you're seeing such a massive outpouring of creativity. And you raise questions that are not necessarily central to your work, but it invites us to think about what it means when you make certain forms of expression criminal and who you criminalize, and when you stifle that obviously fantastically level of creativity that exists in a country. What does that do to the country and the people? But the question I wanted to ask you is what were your sources for interpreting the murals?
Yeah, so I guess one of them was the help through the Bogota graffiti artist and the graffiti tour. And so they share a lot of information. But I also had to do a lot of research about, and some of them I wasn't able to find the artists, but who created which mural and where did they get their money from. So like I mentioned, some of the murals and traditionally like the bigger murals are funded by like organizations or even the Colombian government because they are trying to like change the scene. And so there is that, but also I was there for about a month, and when I was there I really spent a lot of time with Colombian students when I was at the Universidad. And they really like shared it, and because it is so it's everywhere, people are talking about it, whether it's like someone on the bus or someone in the school, and so that's kind of like where, but also doing research
with a sociologist, when you study like all the sociology of graffiti.
I grabbed a lot from urban art studies, visual arts, cultural anthropology, a lot of different areas, and it was definitely very interdisciplinary because there was like the creative art side, but also the contextualizing the history, which I delved into within the actual thesis.
Kristen.
Thank you both. It's super interesting. I agree with Dr. Lewis that the images from Bogota are like they're interesting. You want to look at them.
Powerful.
So I wanted to. I have a question for both of you, but Ali, I think that what I started thinking about with what you were, what you did and what you're talking about is that it isn't only that oral histories are like fruitful and tell us things that we don't already really know about the world that we live in and the ways we understand oppression, but that talking about oral history brings up the question of like what the archive is and what it does and its insufficiencies, and also the ways that archive has been a weapon. And so I was wondering, kind of in light of that, and that's very much where my own research is, if you might talk about the differences between what you were able to record, like in your thesis, and what you're able to remember as like an embodied archive, and not to ask you what that memory is, but to if you could just comment on that gap. And then Lenica, this is sort of similar to what you already said, but if you might speak a little bit to any connections you were able to make to like other graffiti or muralism kind of movements or practices that are happening throughout Latin America, or even you mentioned like hip hop culture and maybe how the like transnational like hip hop culture from New York might influence what's happening in Bogota.
Maybe we can gather more questions so that we can answer somehow together.
Yeah, phenomenal pieces and phenomenal presentations, very interesting topics. I have a question for Ali. So you picked the intergenerational oral history methodology, but the interesting thing here is it's your family too, right? It's not just the methodology out there, but it's personal. And so I wanted to ask, what impact did this methodology have on your research project? How did it impact the fact that you're researching your family? And so the impact on your research, and if you want to talk a little bit about the impact it had on you.
I will also have a question for Ali, which is also part of my conversation with Professor Montero while we were discussing, your thesis and the final result, of your thesis. And the question is, what is the future step in this project? Because you are the scholar, right? You are bringing together these voices, and you are, in addition, bringing this reflective piece that is the one that you shared with us today. But your voice is not part of the archive, right? So, what is the next step? And for LACA, as you are in environmental study, you are like deep into this discipline. So based on your expertise in environmental studies, like what does it mean to study like a landscape that somehow it implements nature, but it's not like it's an urban environment, like it's not the typical kind of natural environment you expect from Colombia, right? It's not selva, it's not mountains, it's something completely different. Any other questions? We can go with this, please.
Okay. Okay, so, wow, these are a lot of really good questions. Well, I grew up really looking up to my grandmother, my mother, and my aunt because they always seemed like just such strong figures in my life. Like they were superwomen, like they could do anything, and I really looked up to them. And so growing up, I never felt like they truly knew how amazing they were. At times, I feel like what they had experienced, their traumatic experience, maybe tainted their perception of themselves. And so for me, it was a really beautiful experience to see how they felt transformed, or they felt a sense of power through this process of oral history. And so the end product truly allowed them to feel confident and to be able to not have to always hide or suppress particular familial histories. And so as a family member, that just brought me like a lot of simply joy, because I feel like that's probably a turning point for my family. So I'm really indebted for the opportunity to be able to pursue a project like this, especially at a place like Brown University, and for it to be valued.
Absolutely.
And I guess that so it had an impact on me on the family side because I got to see my family, affected by this, but also it changed my perspective about academic research. I feel like I might become somewhat of an anthropologist, I think, because I've been leaning on a lot of ethnographic research methods in my other research projects, and it's so easy to make assumptions that as researchers we might be all-knowing, or that we may spend a particular amount of time or live our entire lives in our communities, and we know we understand things in their totality. But by doing this project with my family, who I know so intimately well, to know that there are still gaps in knowledge and intergenerational sharing, really makes me add like an extra layer of care to my research in other settings as well. So I think that's another way that this project has really transformed me. And in terms of future steps, so intentionally, this project kind of transformed. At first, it was going to focus and center around my grandmother, but that proved to be really painful for my grandmother. And so by creating the space of support between my grandmother, my aunt, and my mother, we were able to discuss events in ways that highlighted her, but also decentered her. And so including myself in that jumble felt like a little too much because someone needed to be the facilitator at one point. Someone needed to grab the tissues, someone needed to give the hug. And so that's the position that I took during this project. But I did dabble a little bit because I'm a part of a writing community with my advisors. I did dabble a little in writing paragraphs from these vignettes and into a more, I would consider it creative nonfiction role where I depict in a creative way the experiences I have heard and I have grown up with and the stories that they have shared with me. And I feel like that might be the future of this project because I have an archive to work with. But I do need to take a step back as a family member first, process, and then go from there.
Yeah, good to delve into your question. So yeah, what my work was really trying to do was to honor and share these histories of resistance. And I actually grabbed a lot of inspiration from this project called Contested Cities, which is by an Argentinian social anthropologist and graphic designer. And she focuses on decolonial projects and practices of like translocal urban learning, which is altering research dynamics. So basically it considers the value of city spaces as knowledge reproduction sites. And so I really wanted to utilize the urban art as that knowledge source. And also like inspired by sound photography, which comes from this global sound project, which is called Cities and Memory. And this brings like different audio clips of different cities so that like I found different sounds. So some of the audio that I used for this was from actually Cities and Memories, and there was a clip of a protest in Bogota. And so that protest sound was actually in the background throughout the video. But yeah, I really grabbed from a lot of different artists, and I actually was able to connect and learn about who drew what and who was working with who through Instagram. And so I actually connected with a lot of the artists there, and I followed some, and some of them followed me back. And so it's also really kept me engaged with the art because even though I was in Bogota in 2019, which feels like a really long time, they're still producing art, and especially after COVID. And it's, I think, also raising awareness. And I'm also interested now about traveling back to Colombia and what the art speaks about, especially now considering the dynamics of COVID. A lot of the artists that created a lot of murals actually were affected by COVID, and some of them passed away. So the art community has also been very affected. But when I was doing some research, I found this report by the Colombian International Center for Transitional Justice, and they basically, they're an organization working to hold perpetrators of human atrocities accountable, and they really reiterated the influence that media has on constructing the narrative of the peace process in Colombia and the way that the citizens have been affected by it or not. And so I wanted to make this video because it's a different form of media, but it also it goes places. It can go beyond, the art goes beyond me, and that's really what I was trying to do, transport the viewer into the city and recontextualize the art. And I throughout my thesis I say recontextualize, re-legitimize, reimagine, because this art is already doing so much, but my addition to it is extending it in this way to add to the new scholarly work that is really focused on visual and audio narratives, and creating knowledge. And then to answer Erika's question about the city, something that I've kind of also delved in within my environmental studies career is understanding city spaces as the environment and not separating nature from city. And so I think the art also kind of helps in enabling that connection, like we saw with a lot of the animals, sometimes in parks and different areas. And there was so much more art that I wish I could have shared and also put within the video, but I also had to be selective with some of the things because some of the art does more than other, but it's all very, very valuable, and it's doing so much in so many different realms of either like policy, collective trauma healing, all of these different things.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. I'd like to invite now Nels Salzman, our last presenter of the day, to join us. Maybe we can prepare. Oh, thanks, Ali. So Nels Salzman is a senior from Denver, Colorado, double concentrating comparative literature and Latin American Caribbean studies. Nell has worked in Nicaragua and Ecuador and spent last summer volunteering at the US-Mexico border. Her favorite classes at Brown have been the ones that got her involved with the Latin American community in Providence, volunteering in ESL kindergarten classes, and interviewing Latinx artists, community leaders. Nell hopes to eventually use her language skills to help Spanish-speaking immigrants, either through translation, community organizing, or legal aid. Her senior thesis in Latin American studies, because there is another one in comparative literature, is about secondary traumatic stress disorder as a volunteer at the US-Mexico border, and about how qualitative research should be used to inform policy decisions about immigration. I had the privilege of being Nell's primary advisor and very grateful to Professor Kristen Collins for serving as Nell's second reader. We are all very grateful to Kristen, as you could hear. The title of Nell's thesis is Secondary Traumatization in Migrant Caregivers, Critical Reflections on Humanitarian Aid in El Paso.
Thank you so much, Jerica, for the introduction. I'm honored to be in this group of incredible thinkers and fellow people of Latin American Caribbean studies. As Erica mentioned, I'm also a comparative literature concentrator, and so a lot of my work and my thesis is writing based. So I'm actually going to read a lot of writing that I wrote for my thesis. So I'm just going to jump right into it. I believe that the ability to communicate in another language allows for a depth of connection and reach of storytelling that are invaluable. From an early age, I've been drawn to Spanish. I went to a bilingual elementary school and an international middle school, and so some of my earliest memories are centered around this unique learning environment. Fundraisers at salsa clubs, tamales and green chili at school potlucks, Dia de los Muertos art projects, and spirited soccer games. Many of my friends in elementary school and a close friend on my high school soccer team were undocumented. Unlike them, I never had to worry about flying on an airplane or getting pulled over by a cop or being eligible for scholarships. These friendships formed the basis for my desire to give back to my community. I feel incredibly lucky for all that I've had access to and know that by assisting with translation or engaging with advocacy efforts, I can use my facility with language to make an impact where it's needed. This perspective from an early age is what has drawn me to volunteer in my communities, including for over 10 weeks at a border refugee shelter last summer. I also understand my position as an outsider in these communities. This semester and last semester, I've been thinking a lot about all the people I met this summer when I lived in El Paso at Casa de Refugiado. I've been weighing how to take this experience with me, and I've been grappling with race and privilege and how to best tell someone else's story. I ultimately decided that the most unique perspective I can share about the border isn't about the stories of the people who I worked with, but instead the direct experience of what it's like to live and work at a refugee shelter, the frustrations, the anxieties, and the sadness that comes from dealing with the traumas caused by such structural inequities. This is my abstract. My project focuses on volunteer experiences at the refugee shelter that I worked at. I explore violent, gendered, and racialized policies that have contributed to the flow of migrants from Central and South America to the United States. I first provide broad context and reconceptualize the notion of humanitarian crisis as a structural breakdown due to clear policy decisions made by the United States. Through interviews and personal testimony, I demonstrate the emotional toll of the trauma that many migrants carry with them, from their journeys and how this trauma affects humanitarian aid volunteers. By measuring secondary traumatic stress, STS, that volunteers exhibit, this work emphasizes the importance of using data from volunteers that work with traumatized clients to inform policy decisions about immigration. I ask readers to critically reflect on ways that politics can practice compassion. To respond productively to the high levels of STS found, I then provide a number of policy alternatives to mitigate emotional burnout and compassion fatigue. The project also creates a creative exhibition consisting of a photography exhibition that pairs audio with photographs at the border. Ultimately, there's power in resistance of focused research, data collection, and art. Viewed together, all of these different elements portray harsh realities and shortcomings of the US immigration system. So this is Annunciation House, which is the shelter that I worked on at this summer. It's a big warehouse located off Highway 11 in El Paso. And when I got there, I was really shocked because it really is this massive warehouse and there are no signs outside. And I got there and I was, it's just this big building and it doesn't have very much infrastructure at all. The people who arrived at the shelter all come from Customs and Border Patrol, and the Border Patrol buses drop people off, like hundreds of people every single day, and we as volunteers have to deal with them, and often the volunteer numbers are a lot less than the actual numbers of people that are arriving. Volunteering was really, really intense. We worked 60 hours a week and we saw and heard incredibly traumatic things. One shift, I stayed up all night with a woman who was having a miscarriage. She had come to the shelter that morning complaining of chest and heart pain. We took her to the hospital where we found out that the miles of running and hiding had put too much strain on her body. The doctors gave her a pill and discharged her. As I helped her through the process of passing her fetus, I wondered if the hospital had released her because they didn't want to deal with the annoyances of treating a woman without legal papers. She passed her baby at 4 a.m. At her request, I took a photo. I saw a lot of things. I saw 2 18-year-olds be dragged by an ICE official to our door in hand and feet cuffs. I saw a 14-year-old give birth. I saw a woman have a heart attack when she found out her son, who had been in detention with her, was sent back to Mexico. As a volunteer, how was I supposed to carry the pain of others? What pain was I entitled to feel? How could I help them, and how could I elicit sympathy in others? I'm going to share with you a journal entry that I wrote when I was there about the wall, which I found to be a really striking part of my volunteer experience. It's one thing to hear and to read about the wall, and another to stand beside it, poke your fingers through it, and stare up at it. It's a 30-foot tall fence that runs the length of the border between El Paso and Juarez, and it's striking. It's really a method to slow down migrants so that Border Patrol can more easily arrest them. Only coyotes know how and when it's safe to make the crossing. Migrants typically have 15-minute windows. They climb the wall with hanging ladders, use burlap sacks to shift across the top, and then shimmy down the tall poles. People of all different athletic and physical abilities attempt to make the climb, and many of them fall off. Due to the high volume of fallings at the wall, Annunciation House has a shelter strictly devoted to helping those that have injured themselves during this process. People arrive with broken arms, hips, backs, and necks. Volunteers help them go to the bathroom, dress themselves, and control their medication intake. There is inherent psychological trauma that comes with falling. Migrants feel they've failed even before setting a foot on the other side of the border. In the past few months, there has been an increase in failed border wall crossings. People are coming in desperation, seeking opportunity, independence, and community, only to find themselves in a hospital bed. As I stood there last summer, staring through the wall, I thought about how, more than anything, this climbable fence is a political statement. It's arbitrary and material in nature, crisscrossed metal, numbered gates, scattered tall posts, but incredibly loaded in its human implications. One day at the office, I found a record of the fallen that the shelter had taken this year. I copied down 5 months from October to February. The record is terrible, but it shows how the body is mistreated, tortured, and dehumanized along the journey. I kept reminding myself that these people are just the ones the shelter has seen and helped. There were likely many more injuries that go unrecorded and unannounced. So in my research that I did this semester, I combined quantitative and qualitative methods, conducting interviews with a lot of the people that I worked with last summer at the border. I sent a survey out to 50 people who had worked at Annunciation House within the past 10 years and used this STS scale, you can see. And so that's the quantitative part of my research. I found that over half, 52.4 respondents, had a total STSS score that falls between 44 and 72, indicating that they had received they had felt high levels of secondary traumatic stress, which is something that I think I felt also a lot this semester and last semester when I got back from my time at the border. And also people exhibited PTSD symptoms as well. And the qualitative part of my research was transcribed interviews with 25 of the people that I reached out to, and I used Buoyant Tools, which is an online computer program to categorize the quotes. Buoyant Tools was used as follows. Emotional symptoms were demonstrated with expressed exhaustion and numbness, distress and anxiety. Cognitive symptoms were demonstrated with expressed intrusive thought patterns. Behavioral symptoms were demonstrated with expressed avoidant and checking behaviors, and physical symptoms were demonstrated with compassion fatigue and expressed fatigue. And so these are the different categories, as I mentioned, the emotional, the cognitive, the behavioral, and the physical. And in my thesis, I included more quotes. So ultimately, I argue that policy really should be based on qualitative research, and it's a pipe dream, really, but I think there are ways in which qualitative data is more representative of human experience and should be put into policymaking. Data-driven policy is really important. I think in my future career endeavors or wherever I am doing, I really think that that is something I want to fight for, is that human experience should be used to drive policy. I included a couple other policy alternatives that I found when I was researching. I think there should be more material and human resources from state and policy levels. These include infrastructure and translation. Like I mentioned, the shelter was just really a warehouse, and people slept on cots, and we handed them bags of toothbrushes and stuff. So I think there just needs to be more resources. There needs to be a higher degree of commitment to keeping families together, because that's another really, really important thing, is that migrants were often really distressed because they didn't know where their family members were. They hadn't seen their family members for months in detention, or they've been separated. I also argue for trauma-informed care, and that is something that I really believe in. I think the impact of trauma is so strong, and there are paths for recovery, and trauma-informed care is an approach that's being implemented in a lot of nursing settings, and I think there needs to be more research about how that should be implemented in refugee shelters as well. It's really big, and this thesis is really big, and it was hard for me to even know what to include in my presentation because there's so much to say and to think about. So yeah, ultimately, in my research, I combined quantitative and qualitative methods. It was sort of a method for me of reconciling and coming to terms with the structural violence and the blatant inequalities that I witnessed last summer volunteering at the border. In the process of writing this thesis and interviewing volunteers about secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue, I was brought back to what it was like to witness hundreds of cases of traumas of the world stage day in and day out. It's been a worthy but difficult exercise for me to be reminded of what made my time there so intense. I think this thesis is more of a textured case study than anything else. I start with critical analysis about historical draw factors, and then I combine psychology research and volunteer interviews with conceptual understandings of the way that humanitarian aid needs to be reconsidered and reconceptualized. I offer policy methods, and then I provide a lengthy experience of my own time volunteering at the border. I also have a photography little exhibit happening this Friday where I include photos that I've taken that I showed in my presentation, landscapes of the border mixed with audio. And I thought a lot about the exhibit and how I wanted to represent the experience and what I wanted people to gain, friends that I wanted to invite, and those types of things. And I think that what I really want from this whole thesis and this whole project is just for people to understand the need and how much need there is and to do what they can to help. My first week in El Paso, I struggled to find a good word to describe the crumbling ceilings, the mildewy trailer park showers, the foul-smelling porta potties, and the substandard foods that we served our guests. I grappled with the fact that most Americans would gag at the living conditions in the shelter, while our guests often told me that this was the cleanest shelter and the best service they'd had in months or even years. The last week I was there, I finally found the word: wrong. It just feels wrong. I think this type of volunteer work isn't easy, and I don't think that everyone can or should have to do it, but I think everyone should ask themselves what they can do to make an impact in the lives of vulnerable people around them. And I think what draws me to Latin American Caribbean studies and comparative literature is that element of language and how we can use language to really help and aid in these communities as well. So yeah, I think the vibrancy of my photos offer a message of life in dark places, and they ask viewers to question the arbitrary nature of borders, as well as serving as a call to action. I think everyone should do what they can, put themselves into their communities. I really want to thank Erica and Kristen for helping me, and especially this week as I gear up for the photo exhibition, and all along the process I really enjoyed the Latin American Caribbean Studies capstone class. And I'm really grateful also I received a grant to go back and do more volunteering work over winter break to really lock in my interviews and get more photos. So I'm really grateful also to the LACA department for that aid and help. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Nell, for this presentation and for your thesis, which is also very powerful and necessary and urgent. So we have 5 minutes now time for questions for Nell. Felipe.
Yeah, I just have a quick logistical question in terms of your photography exhibit. So where is it? How can we?
Yeah, it's gonna be at 7. Or I still send the time, but I'll create a Facebook invitation now and thank you. It's gonna be in the evening in List in room 220.
Erica, you'll send the invitation?
Yes, yeah.
Make sure we get it.
Kristen.
Mel, thank you so much for sharing and for being so open about how great you feel with everyone's support you. It's been a pleasure for me to work with you. So, but I wondered if you could say a little bit more about kind of the place between the wanting. I think a lot of us can really understand a sort of personal feeling of wanting to help when we see like tragedy happen, especially ongoing and repeated tragedy. And then we've also talked so much about what it means to intervene at the level of systems. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and I think this is a hard question because I know it's something that you're struggling with still, but how did those things, that sort of human desire to help, and then this more critical intervention about changing systems and structures, kind of where's that place in the middle?
And I have a question too. Like I know that you're a writer, Nell, and you aspire to be a journalist. Right? So the two things are very related. So I was wondering, like, you wrote this piece now, and your thesis is partly research, I would say half and half, right? And partly like all your writing journal during your time as a volunteer, and then there is the other section, which are the interviews with other volunteers. Again, like a little bit like the question I asked Ali, what will be the future of this piece, and when you will be a journalist? I think you will actually be a journalist. I don't know which language, maybe in both, hopefully. So somehow, how do you think you can continue to give voice to these to these silent, like, voices. Somehow we talked a lot about this Ellie's Lost Children Archive and building an archive of silent voices, and I think that volunteers are also a silent voice, right? So how do you envision the future of this action that you have conducted here?
Yeah, to your question, Kristen, I think the wanting to help and the volunteer space with this like massive structural problem is something I thought so much about this summer, and and it's a kind of a contradiction in my thesis that I don't even think I fully tackled because it's so big. I think the two don't need to be mutually exclusive. I think there can be bolstered humanitarian aid with also sort of a commitment to changing and thinking about these bigger structural issues. And I think also knowing that the humanitarian aid stems from all of these policies is something that's really important. And in my other thesis, I do a lot of thinking about journalistic writing about immigration and how I think those types of stories often don't highlight the structural inequalities as much as they should. This idea of humanitarian aid as a crisis, which is something I mentioned, but it's not a crisis because it's years and years and years and years and years of direct policy that's changed the outcomes of the lives of all these people that are now coming. So I think it's just should all be in conversation, and I think the policy can also be directed towards the aid. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's a hard question to even answer because it's so big, but I do think it's one that I want to keep thinking about in my life, and even after this thesis is done and I graduate. In regards to your question, Erica, about the future of this piece, I don't know if I'm gonna like actually publish the piece or anything like that, but I do think that just writing it and doing these interviews helped me get an understanding of how policy crafting happens. And I'm like gonna live in DC this summer and work for think tank, and then after that I'm moving to Ecuador to do the Peace Corps, and I think that, and I'm also gonna try to do some writing for the Global Affairs Journal. So I think generally, like, I see this work having helped me get to my next steps in life, and I think that it will just aid and just make me a better thinker in terms of how we use voices. I also really firmly believe in the power of capturing voices in terms of like radio journalism, and I think that's a field that I haven't really like delved into, and I want to explore more. And through writing this thesis, I did a lot of recordings of audio of people and things in the shelter, and I think that's something that will help me if I ever want to explore podcasts or some type of work like that, which I really do. Yeah. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Ned. Thank you very much to all of you. I think that this is what Ned just said, like somehow how this is prepared for the future, whatever she would like to do. I hope that this will be the case for you have like reached such a level of maturity in the past 4 years, and even in the context of this thesis, in the past 6 months or whatever, 9 months since the beginning of the thesis, that it's really a pleasure to see how nicely you have advanced with your ideas and were able to write them and communicate them today with us, which is like one of the biggest challenges of research, right? Not only to build the research, but also to be able to share the research. So I think that now we're going to ask Veronica, Professor Veronica Ingham, who was a member of the LACA Honors Thesis Prize Committee, to announce the LACA Honors Prize winner. It has been challenging, I guess. So maybe if you want to recount a little bit about the process.
So, yes, I'm Veronica Ingham. I'm a senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. As Professor Durante said earlier today, Professor Claudia Elliott and Professor Felipe Martinez Pinzon and myself were tasked with reading this year's LACA Undergraduate Honors Thesis with the purpose of selecting the thesis prize. Now, first, let me underscore that the committee found Felipe's, Max's, Ali's, Lanica's, and Nell's thesis extremely well thought out, provoking, relevant, moving, and I could go on with the adjectives. It was really a pleasure to read your work, and that is a testament to all this time that you five have spent and invested in your project during your time at Brown. And for that, and on behalf of this thesis committee, I want to really commend you. We all know, and commend you all, we all know there are many opportunity costs for your time at Brown. And so the only fact that you were able to, make this time and wanted to make this time to devote the energy and put in the effort is really absolutely fantastic. So I really want to congratulate you all for that. Now, moving on to this year's winner of the LACA Undergraduate Thesis Prize. The winner this year is Nell for her honors thesis entitled Secondary Traumatization in Migrant Caregivers, Critical Reflection on Humanitarian Aid in El Paso. And let me just give you some of the adjectives that I would say specifically reflect Nell's work. Well, we've heard all the presentations, and the last one was Nell's, and I think we all can agree that her research was particularly original. I would say interdisciplinary in the way it extensively connects many bodies of literature. Sensitive because of the focus on the volunteers instead of actually focusing on the migrants out of a sense of respect for their privacy. Mature in that there's this personal journal that is, I would say, a very unique contribution that she has in her writing, the quantitative and qualitative research methodology, the contextualized case study that she develops are all very good complementary ways to bring a narrative to life and present this reality that she's trying to share with us. I think it was also something that struck me and struck us in the committee is the courage in the work. I think there was courage in many, I think in all of your pieces, I would say. It's something that I really, really appreciate, and we did as a committee too. I also particularly like the practical and at the same humane recommendations that you have in the research. The part about human experience driving policy, for example, in the commitment to keep families together. I could go on, and I could go on about all your work. It was really hard to pick, and we had to pick one. I would say, take this work and run with it. That is my advice to all of you. Congratulations on the work. It's terrific, and thank you for sharing it with us today. We look forward to the public photography exhibit. I hope we get that information.
Okay, so thank you very much, Veronica, Professor Patsy Lewis, Professor Ingham, Professor Collins, Professor Emke for being here today. And we're very proud for your research accomplishments. I know that we will not have a commencement ceremony this year because we have a lot of, our concentrators are mainly double concentrators, and they also have a lot of friends in their primary, let's say, concentration. So that's okay. Today, we're already, it's a big moment to celebrate you as young scholars and intellectuals, and this is the best pleasure for us. So thank you everyone for being here or online, for being part of this undergraduate research day, and we hope to see you in any case during commencement around campus to celebrate you again in a few weeks. And good luck for the end of the semester and the final exams. So we also would like to mention that on Friday, this will be before, basically, after, so no, or after in the meantime, Nell's exhibit, we have this important event, which is a performance by Guatemalan musician Rebecca Lane, organized by Professor Collins, and she will also have a songwriting workshop open to everyone in English, Spanish, and both.
So we have a few more slides left, so if you're interested in a songwriting for social justice workshop.
Yeah, it would be great if you could just write your name here, and then we would be
or you
in
can
touch
just like
with you. Okay, this may be very interesting for you all, and then this will also be our end of the year plaques reception, so you are all invited to join us.
Food and drinks.
7 p.m.
Probably soft. Are we having hot drinks?
No,
We'll find out. So and there will be a performance by Mezcla, which will happen here in the Agora. 7 p.m. We'll see you here in the Agora, okay, on Friday. But this is already on our website. And if you're interested in the workshop, please write down your names here and
I'll send you
be in
an
touch.
email.
Thank you so much, everyone. We can take a picture, I guess, like, right, all of us. I tried to protect the food because people were. So I went out to put like, you know, like some touch, but I think there is very little left. It's very
Oh, really?
Yes. Yeah, but in the past, we know we bring it at the back.
Yeah, why would you should have done?
Wow. Okay.
Well,
there is still something remaining.
still mingle it.
I think the songwriting thing can be interesting to you, Felipe.
Yes.
Me tengo que ir a la presentación.
Bueno, nos sacamos una foto.
Oh, the PowerPoints, we should do.
Okay.
I want each.
Experience.
We take a picture very quickly because Ali has to go, and then she goes. Una fotita.
And I don't know if you'd be interested. Sophie McKibben was a former student at Brown. She was my TA for several years who helped with this kind of work. And she worked for NPR.
Ned, can you come for a second? Professor Emke, I just steal her for a second just for a picture. Okay. But then she will be here, no worries.
Huh?
She will be here.
Oh,
to
yeah,
talk.
no, I understand. Sure.
Ah, no, es que tenía que salir. Que había tomado mucho café en la mañana.
Y es como con palpitaciones.
I already know.
Listen, thank you for the computer.
No problem. Happy to be of service. Is that your charger?
Sí, es verdad. Después vas a ir a class.
Sí, voy a trabajar.
Huh?
Voy a trabajar acá.
Okay, because I have a question, a bibliographic question for you.
I'll ask you there.
Okay, so Lenica, she wants to join the workshop. And I will give you the names Felipe, Felix Mendes, and Veronica, okay, Godina.
Okay.
I think we already touched with them. So, vas a venir, ¿no? Al workshop.
Sí.
Okay.
Is that the same as the last? You said the last reception.
No, the workshop is it's at 11:30. It's gonna be in one of the rooms in the other one building. It's like an hour and a half, like super informal, just like to talk with her right now about like songwriting, poetry making.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh, very much.
I'll send you a
I'm
little
sorry
bit
it was
of
late.
it.
I couldn't have come before 10, but
That's
I'm not
Yeah, I'm so happy that you come. Every time you come, I'm so happy to see you.
or before 11.
Great job.
No, it's terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, right? They're so good.
Oh,
Hola, mira qué bonito.
Gracias, perdón. Oh, no, it's for me. Gracias. Gracias, I'm sorry for
Oh, thank you.
Sí le quería preguntar por the incomplete. ¿Todavía está?
¿Está?
No
So I
sé.
should, okay, I will take it. Just send me a message.
Okay.
Remember, okay?
Okay, muchas gracias.
Mandame un mensaje, no me lo olvido.
Is this from the air?
Yeah,
Great,
please.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we're all set. We don't forget anything. Yes, Felipe is for booking this. Oh, yes, it's things here.
¿Cómo le fue?
Muy bien, yo creo.
Yo me tuve que ir porque me toca hacer lo mismo mañana.
A vos, tipo, para el máster, para el MBA. Bueno, es más, 10 minutos.
40. Sí, muchísimo. Pero digo, bien, es un tema que he estudiado un año entero.
Bueno, pero una silencio con el
Sí.
hacer el PowerPoint. ¿Estás escribiendo y vas a leer o...?
No, lo tengo como separado por puntos y sé qué decir. Tengo mi iPad, así que... Creo que hay problema.
Felipe, your things are inside. Felipe, tus cosas.
Sí. Claro, no soy. Gracias por el
¿Lo lograste?
Sí.
Please. Tus cosas están ahí, son
No
las
tengo clase aquí.
¿Quién ganó?
Neta. Voluntarios en el board. El programa de los voluntarios. No los voluntarios.
Entonces...